I used to suffer from sleep paralysis and night terrors frequently when I was a child. My parents never took it seriously and figured I was just having vivid nightmares and it was nothing to worry about. It slowly went away with age, and I almost forgot I got them until they recently started coming back. My father passed away my senior year of college, and ever since I often spent the night screaming myself awake from nightmares about his death. My sleep paralysis came back slowly, typically with my brain being in a semi-conscious state but unable to move my body. Usually I would just fall back asleep, as these instances would only last a minute or so. They progressively got longer the months following his death, and would last upwards of 10 minutes with me being fully conscious and able to open my eyes, but unable to move or yell for help. I live with my girlfriend, and a couple times she was able to shake me out of this state, as she is a light sleeper and would hear my heavy, erratic breathing and assume something was wrong. Normally my eyes would just scan the room until I fell back asleep or she woke me up. For a while, all I was staring at was my dark room, barely lit by the moon out our window. No one else was in the room except the two of us, although I was always terrified of something I could never explain. A couple weeks ago, I had one of my episodes, and when I opened my eyes, there was a dark shadow cast against the wall across from me. The shadow was oblong, and it was hard to tell if it was a human or not. I continued to stare at it for a few minutes, but it never moved. I had convinced myself it was my eyes playing tricks on me, or a shadow from a tree outside our window, and fell back asleep eventually. The next few episodes I had involved this same shadow, and I had convinced myself it had to be one of the trees outside my window. There was nothing else in my room that could have made that shape. I had never noticed this shadow before, but figured it must have been the position of the moon or something. After being plagued with insomnia due to my sleep paralysis, I finally made an appointment to see a doctor to get help for it. Whether they recommended medication or a therapist or some combination, I was willing to do anything for a good night's sleep. My girlfriend admitted she was having difficulty sleeping as well, as she tried her best to wake me up whenever she could tell I was struggling. Other than my erratic breathing, sometimes she would wake up to me staring at her, looking horrified, and she knew to wake me up. That night, after making the appointment, things got drastically worse. When I was a small child, I vividly remember seeing shadowy figures that looked human that would taunt me from across my room or hover over me with sinister smiles and dark eyes. As a child, these terrified me, and I remember my religious grandmother telling me it was demons coming to visit me and to continue praying for them to leave. The night after booking the appointment, one of the shadowy figures I routinely saw visited me again. It was a tall man wearing a large top hat who looked like he belonged in the 19th century. I couldn't make out many of his features other than his face. I didn't recognize him, and at first he stood by my bedroom door and smiled at me. For a few moments he didn't move, but then slowly crept closer to our bed. My girlfriend slept closest to the door, and subsequently this monster, and he switched his attention to her as he continually moved towards us. In my head I was screaming as my eyes darted between the two of them, but nothing was coming out of my mouth. It felt like someone had shoved cement down my throat and superglued my lips together. I could hear my erratic breathing and hoped it would wake her up, but she continued snoring slightly, and my panic continued to grow. The shadowy monster leaned in when he was a few inches from her face, his eyes fixated on her with his horrific smile. Every muscle in my body was locked, and there was nothing I could do except watch. The monster eventually looked up and locked eyes with me, and in an instant he was leaping at me. My eyes closed and I felt my body flying from my bed and landing on the floor with a thud. Pain had immediately shot through my back, but luckily I was able to roll over onto my knees. My girlfriend was up at this point, asking what had happened, and I realized I was fully awake and could move and talk. The shadowy figure was nowhere to be seen. Before I got the chance to go to my appointment, I felt the familiar panic rising in me one night when I woke up and couldn't move. And there it was, the shadowy figure of a man standing by my bedroom door. Even though I had seen him a few times before, I still had that childlike panic, as if monsters were lurking in my closet. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed there was no top hat this time, and figured it must be some other figure that I once saw. I couldn't make out any facial features when it started moving closer to me. Instead of going towards my girlfriend, like the other monster did, this one slowly walked towards my side of the bed. I was lying on my back, and my eyes were the only thing that could follow him. When he got closer to me, he knelt down beside me, and I could finally see his facial features. It was my father, although his eyes were very dark instead of their usual light blue. Although I should have been ecstatic to see him, as I had prayed to see his face one last time since he passed, I still felt the overwhelming panic coursing through me. There were so many times where I sobbed, wishing I could see his face one last time, but this didn't feel right. Nothing good ever happened during my sleep paralysis episodes, so I knew something was wrong. The smile on his face was definitely the same that belonged to my dad, and we just stared at one another for a few minutes. I could only see his eyes and smile in the darkness that swallowed his face. The wrinkles around his eyes and the long scar that went across his cheek were nowhere to be seen. His smile wasn't sinister. He seemed genuinely happy to see me. I started to wonder if I was dead and making my way into the afterlife. The shadow moved closer and leaned over me, and I felt a weight press against my chest. It felt like someone had put a medicine ball on me, and it was getting hard to breathe. My head swarmed with unintelligible whispers that I couldn't make sense to. My father's eyes continued to stare into mine, with the smile never leaving his face. I wanted to struggle against the weight, but my body was still paralyzed. Some other force was starting to move me, and after a few moments I was able to move and sat up in bed. The weight against my chest was gone, but I couldn't stop crying. My girlfriend had woken me up, saying it sounded like I was choking. I remember ripping my shirt off to look at my chest, but there were no marks to indicate anything had ever touched me, and there were no shadowy figures to be seen anywhere. I didn't dare tell my girlfriend what I saw. I told her about a shadowy figure on top of me, but I didn't mention that I knew who it was. She had never suffered from sleep paralysis, so I already felt crazy whenever I told her what happened to me in that state. At this point, I was shocked she wasn't trying to get me locked up in a psych ward. That was the last night terror I have had thus far, and am working with a therapist to find the cause of these issues. My insomnia has been rough, and most nights I am lucky to get 3 hours of sleep. Luckily, by that point, I am so exhausted I don't have any dreams at all. My girlfriend even jostles me every time she wakes up, which is very often now, just in case I was having an episode and she couldn't tell. Every time I close my eyes now, I just see my father's dark, shadowy figure staring back at me.